I thought my daughter was just afraid of the dark. Kids see shadows, their minds play tricks on them, it's normal, right? But when she told me the shadow had been standing next to her mother, watching her in the hallway, something inside me shifted. I set up cameras to prove there was nothing there. What I found? It wasn't a ghost. It was something much worse. And my wife, she already knew. The lingering scent of antiseptic clung to his skin as Daniel Harris made his way up the narrow driveway, his boots dragging heavily against the cracked pavement. Another grueling night shift at Ridgeway Memorial Hospital had come to an end, and the sky was slowly shifting into muted shades of peach and violet as the sun crept over the horizon. He paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp Illinois air, hoping it would wash away the exhaustion weighing down his body. It was futile. The echoes of the past 12 hours followed him, clinging to the corners of his mind, the relentless beeping of monitors, the hurried footsteps in sterile hallways, the haunting cries of loss that never quite faded. For a decade, Daniel had worked as an EMT in this town where secrets rarely lasted and everyone knew your story before you did. It was a stark contrast to the unpredictable, transient life of his childhood, bouncing from one foster home to another. But sometimes, the adrenaline rush of emergency calls felt all too familiar, a chaotic rhythm he had learned to survive by. Fumbling for his keys, he glanced up at the small house he had worked so hard to provide for his family. His gaze settled on the second-floor window, where a soft glow seeped through the curtains. His brows knit together. It was barely 6 a.m., far too early for Sophie to be awake, especially on a Saturday. A familiar unease curled in his stomach as he stepped inside, the quiet warmth of their home doing little to soothe his instincts. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock in the hallway. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he moved toward the staircase, his concern deepening with each step. Reaching Sophie's room, he carefully pushed the door open. A lump of blankets sat curled in the corner of her bed, trembling slightly. Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, had pulled the covers tight around her small frame. Her wide blue eyes, so much like her mother's, glistened with unshed tears. She looked up at him, her face pale, her expression one of pure terror. Something was wrong. She reached out to him, her little hands shaking, and though she said nothing at first, the fear was written all over her face. Daniel sat beside her, gently running his hand over her tangled blonde hair, the warmth of her small body pressing against his. A muffled sob escaped her lips. "The dark," she finally whispered, her voice so soft he barely caught it. His grip on her tightened instinctively. He had never seen Sophie this frightened before, not even after she had woken from nightmares about the monsters she once imagined beneath her bed. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. She hesitated before answering, her fingers gripping his shirt as if grounding herself. I saw something," she finally admitted. His breath hitched. "A shadow," she continued, her voice cracking. "It was in the hallway, and then, it came into my room." A chill ran through Daniel, but he forced a small, reassuring nod. Glancing around, the room appeared just as it had when he left that evening, stuffed animals scattered on the floor, a book lying half open on the bedside table, the glow-in-the-dark stars still clinging to the ceiling. Everything was normal. Safe. But Sophie's fear was real. Kneeling beside her bed, he looked into her eyes. "Sometimes, when we're tired, our minds play tricks on us," he said softly. "Especially when the shadows move just right." Her lip trembled. "But it wasn't a trick," he sighed, brushing his hand over his face. He wanted to believe it was nothing, just the overactive imagination of a child who had spent too much time reading scary stories. "Why don't we go downstairs and make some hot chocolate?" he suggested. "Then you can tell me everything, okay?" She hesitated, but then nodded, allowing him to scoop her up in his arms, blanket and all, and carry her down to the kitchen. As he set her down on a chair, soft footsteps approached from the hallway. "Everything okay?" The familiar voice made him turn. Emma, his wife, stood in the doorway, her dark hair tousled, exhaustion still clinging to her features. In the dim glow of the kitchen light, he caught a glimpse of something in her expression, concern, perhaps, but also something else. A flicker of hesitation. Sophie had a bad dream, Daniel explained as he reached for the cocoa mix. His wife stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's back. "Oh, sweetheart. Was it a nightmare?" Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. "No. It wasn't a dream." A moment of silence stretched between them. "Well," Emma finally said, a small, strained smile appearing on her lips. "There are no ghosts here, love. Just us." Daniel watched the exchange closely. Something about his wife's reaction didn't sit right. It was subtle, but it was there, a tension in the way she touched their daughter, the way she avoided his gaze just slightly. As he poured the warm drink into a mug and set it in front of Sophie, she wrapped her small hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her skin. Some of the fear seemed to melt away as she sipped, color returning to her cheeks. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. Outside, the early morning sun crept higher, casting light through the kitchen window, but inside, an unfamiliar darkness seemed to linger, one that had nothing to do with the shadows on the walls. And for the first time, Daniel wondered if Sophie's fears weren't just the product of an overactive imagination. He just didn't know yet how right she was. Morning light filtered through the curtains, stretching across the wooden floors in pale streaks. The house was quiet, yet the unease from the night before still clung to the air. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Sophie sat motionless, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. She wasn't drinking it. She was staring, at the table, at the floor, at the shadows cast by the furniture. She hadn't spoken much since waking up. Normally, mornings were filled with chatter about her dreams, the stories she made up about her stuffed animals, or reminders of what she wanted to do over the weekend. Today, there was only silence. The fear had settled deep. Across the room, Emma leaned against the counter, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She looked exhausted, but there was something else beneath the tiredness, something in the tightness of her jaw, the way her fingers tapped rhythmically against the ceramic of her coffee cup. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low. He mentioned what Sophie had told him, how she had woken up to something in the hallway, how it had come closer. Emma barely reacted at first. Then, a quiet sigh. A hand brushing through her hair. She told him not to overthink it, that kids had nightmares, that it was normal for them to be scared. Her tone was dismissive, but there was an edge to it, something defensive, as though she needed to believe the words she was saying. Daniel wasn't convinced. The day passed in a fog. Sophie refused to be alone, trailing after them from room to room. Even in broad daylight, she flinched at the smallest movement, at the way the curtains shifted when the heater clicked on. It wasn't just a child's imagination running wild. It was something deeper, something raw. That night, she hesitated before going to bed. When Daniel tucked her in, she gripped his sleeve, her small fingers digging in. He reassured her that everything was fine, that she was safe. But when he turned to leave, she whispered that she didn't want to sleep alone. He hesitated, then carried her to the master bedroom. Emma barely stirred when he set up a small mattress beside their bed. When she finally turned over, her voice was quiet, asking if Sophie was still afraid. She was. Either of them said much after that. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Sophie refused to go upstairs alone. She wouldn't walk down the hallway without checking over her shoulder. Every light in the house stayed on, even during the day. At night, she barely slept, waking up at the smallest sound, her breath coming in ragged gasps. One evening, Daniel came home late. The house was dim, quiet, but not in the way it should have been. Something about the silence felt heavy, expectant. He stepped into the living room and stopped short. Sophie was curled up on the couch, her stuffed bear gripped tightly against her chest. Her eyes were red from crying. She hadn't even noticed him come in. His stomach twisted. He crouched beside her, brushing the hair from her face. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. When she finally looked up at him, she whispered something so softly he almost didn't catch it. It had been here again. But this time, she said, it wasn't just standing in the hallway. It had been near Emma. The words settled into his chest like lead. He turned his gaze toward the kitchen, where Emma stood with her back to them, her hands braced against the counter. She wasn't moving. Just standing there. Something in the air shifted, like the moment before a storm. Daniel held Sophie a little tighter. For the first time, the fear wasn't just his daughter's. It was his own. The night was heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settled too thick, pressing in at the edges. Daniel lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the heating system, the occasional creak of the house settling, and, just beyond those familiar sounds, the steady breathing of Sophie, asleep on the mattress beside their bed. She had refused to sleep alone again. Her small body remained curled under the blanket, fingers still wrapped around the stuffed bear she had been clutching for days now. Even in sleep, her grip never loosened. Across the bed, Emma had her back to him, her breathing deep and even. He wondered if she was really asleep or if she, too, was lying awake, lost in her own thoughts. Something wasn't right. It had started as a child's fear, a shadow in the dark, a bad dream, an overactive imagination. But now, it had taken root. Sophie's fear wasn't fading. It was growing. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more uneasy he became. There were things that didn't add up. The way Emma dismissed it all too quickly, the way she tensed at certain questions, the look on her face when Sophie mentioned seeing something near her. It was subtle, but it was there, a hesitation, a flicker of something deeper than concern. It gnawed at him. By morning, he made up his mind. Later that day, while Emma was out running errands, Daniel stood in the dim hallway outside Sophie's room, staring at the empty space where she had first seen the shadow. He wasn't the kind of man to believe in the supernatural. He had seen enough real horrors in his line of work: accidents, violence, grief in its rawest form. He had no room for ghosts. But this wasn't about ghosts anymore. This was about something, or someone, in his house. His fingers tightened around the small box in his hands, newly purchased security cameras, compact, nearly invisible once installed. He told himself it was to ease Sophie's fears, to prove to her that nothing was there. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the only reason. If something, or someone, was moving through his house at night, he was going to find out. That night, he stayed awake long after Emma and Sophie had gone to bed. The dim glow of his laptop screen cast sharp lines across his face as he adjusted the settings on the cameras, ensuring each one was active and recording. One in the hallway. One near the front door. Another in the living room. And the last, pointed just outside their bedroom door. He sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, watching the live feed. Nothing but stillness. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at him, and he forced himself to lie down. But sleep was restless. And when morning came, he woke with a strange sense of unease curling in his chest. He checked the footage immediately. Hours passed with nothing unusual. Sophie tossing in her sleep, the occasional flicker of light as a car passed outside, the slow shift of shadows as the night deepened. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., something moved. A dark figure, just at the edge of the hallway. Daniel's breath caught. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a shadow shifting against the wall. It was a person. Tall. Moving unnaturally smoothly, gliding rather than walking. His pulse hammered as he watched the figure pause outside their bedroom door. For a moment, it simply stood there, silent, motionless. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. And Emma stepped out. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't startled. She looked at the figure and then she smiled. Daniel slammed the laptop shut. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would shatter his ribs. His hands clenched into fists. Not a ghost. Not a nightmare. This was real. And Emma knew exactly what was happening. Morning came in a haze of tension so thick it felt suffocating. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had no intention of drinking. The weight of the previous night pressed down on his chest, his pulse still unsteady. He had seen it, clear as day, undeniable. A man had been in their home. Not a shadow. Not a trick of Sophie's imagination. A real, living person. And Emma had welcomed him. His mind reeled, replaying the footage over and over. The way she stepped into the hallway. The way her body language never betrayed an ounce of fear. The way she smiled. Not just recognition. Familiarity. As though this wasn't the first time. A soft sound made him glance up. Emma stood at the counter, pouring herself a cup of tea. She looked tired but otherwise normal, like any other morning. But all Daniel could see was the image of her standing in the dark, her expression unreadable as the figure loomed nearby. How long had this been going on? How long had she been lying to him? The sound of small footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Sophie shuffled into the kitchen, her stuffed bear still clutched tightly in her arms. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes flicking between them before slowly making her way to the table. She hadn't smiled in days. It made Daniel's stomach twist. He had to fix this. He had to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. That evening, when Emma stepped out to pick up groceries, Daniel finally did what he had been resisting. He went into her things. He had never been the kind of husband to pry. He respected boundaries, believed in trust. But trust was no longer an option. Rifling through drawers, he searched for anything, any hint, any explanation for what he had seen. And then, tucked inside an old shoebox in the back of the closet, he found it. A phone. Not Emma's usual one. A second phone. Cold realization settled in his chest as he powered it on. The lock screen required no code, and within seconds, messages flashed before his eyes. Oh, R. I miss you. Emma. Not tonight. It's too risky. Oh, R. You worry too much. He never notices. Daniel's hands shook. O.R. He knew that name. Olivier Reed. A name that had surfaced before, distant, unimportant. A client, or so Emma had once said, back when she still offered bits of her life freely. But this wasn't business. It had never been business. He scrolled further, past weeks, months, of messages that blurred together in a sickening mess of deception. Not just flirtation. Not just infidelity. Plans. Secrets. Something bigger than betrayal. And then, at the very bottom, the one message that made his blood run cold. Oh, R. Does he suspect? Emma. No. He believes whatever I tell him. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. A ringing filled his ears, not from the device, but from somewhere deep inside, like a warning siren going off in his brain. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else. Something worse. The front door opened, and Daniel barely had time to shove the phone back into the shoebox before Emma's footsteps echoed down the hall. She appeared in the doorway, holding a bag of groceries, her expression neutral. You okay? He forced his features into something passable, something that wouldn't betray the storm inside. Yeah. Just tired. She gave a small, practiced smile. Long shift? He nodded. Something like that. For a moment she studied him. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. He exhaled slowly. He had to be careful. Whatever was happening, whatever she was wrapped up in, he had to be smart about this. For Sophie's sake. For his own. He had to find out the truth. But now, for the first time since this nightmare began, he realized something terrifying. He might already be too late. The house felt hollow, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of all the unspoken truths lingering within them. Daniel moved through the dimly lit rooms, each step measured, controlled, though his pulse betrayed the calm he tried to maintain. The messages he had read still pulsed in his mind, repeating themselves like a warning he had ignored for too long. There had been no ghost. No imagined figure lurking in the dark. Only a man. A real presence in his home, standing in the same spaces where his daughter had slept, where his wife had walked without hesitation. It had been happening for months, woven into the fabric of their routine, unnoticed until it had already taken root. Across the living room, Emma sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had changed. She moved with the same ease she always had, her expression neutral, but the air between them was different now, charged, expectant. She must have sensed it, the shift in him, the unraveling of the illusion she had built so carefully. Sophie was upstairs, asleep with the door cracked open, a small light illuminating the hallway. She had refused to sleep in complete darkness since that night, the fear still lingering in the corners of her mind. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had spent the last day gathering proof, messages, photos, security footage. It had all been laid out in front of him, undeniable. There was no question of what had happened anymore. The only thing left was what came next. The moment he spoke, Emma stiffened. She didn't look at him right away, but he could see the way her fingers tightened around the phone in her hands. There was no surprise, no attempt to deny what she already knew he had discovered. Her expression remained calm as she finally turned to face him, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the facade. There was no panic, no guilt. Only quiet resignation. The silence between them stretched. Daniel watched her carefully, waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, a plea. But nothing came. Instead, she exhaled, setting her phone down beside her. The words, when they came, were soft, deliberate. She had been planning to leave. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a moment of regret. It was a simple truth, stated as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her presence in this house had already been temporary in her mind. She had been waiting for the right time, waiting for the moment when it wouldn't matter if Sophie saw something strange in the dark, because soon they would be gone, and whatever had haunted her would no longer exist. That had been the plan. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Not just betrayal, but something colder, an understanding that she had been ready to take everything from him without hesitation. He asked about Sophie, though he already knew the answer. The hesitation in Emma's expression was brief, but it was enough. She hadn't just been leaving. She had been planning to take their daughter with her. The pieces fell into place. The quiet reassurances, the dismissive explanations, the way she had carefully controlled every conversation around Sophie's fears. It had never been about protecting her. It had been about ensuring she wouldn't question anything when the time came. The realization sent a slow, steady burn through his chest. Nothing about this had been accidental. By the time she left that night, there was nothing left to say. A suitcase packed hastily, a car pulling away into the darkness, no final words exchanged. Just an absence. A quiet void where she had once stood. The authorities arrived before dawn, taking in the evidence Daniel provided without hesitation. The security footage, the messages, the proof of a man who had moved through their home undetected. Olivier Reed had done this before. His name was tied to multiple investigations, fraud, deception, a pattern of manipulating his way into the lives of unsuspecting families. What had begun as an affair had become something far worse, something calculated. The weight of it settled heavily on Daniel's shoulders. By morning, the house was still. Sophie remained asleep, unaware of the events unfolding beyond the walls of her room. Emma had made her choice. She had walked away without a fight, without so much as a final glance at the life she had once built. That, more than anything, told Daniel how little had truly remained between them. The weeks that followed were quiet. The house no longer felt like a home, so Daniel packed their things, moving them across town, closer to his work, closer to something new. Sophie adapted faster than he expected. She still hesitated before stepping into dark hallways, still reached for his hand in moments when she thought he wasn't looking. But the fear had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier. She still asked about Emma sometimes, but the questions grew fewer. The answers remained the same, carefully measured, softened by the need to protect her from the full weight of the truth. One evening, as he tucked her into bed, she looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "There were no ghosts in this house," she said. He nodded, brushing her hair back from her forehead, agreeing with quiet certainty. The past no longer held them. There was only what lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, it was enough.